Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this, I got whether there is a number, no, anyway, one of the meetings on architecture of the Architecture Biennale. The aim of these meetings is obvious. We want not only to see installations and projects of architects, we want to meet them, we want to talk to them, we want to listen from them, we want to provoke them, we want to be provoked by them. And this meeting is really based on the aim of provocation is very high. I mean, we have two words. One is free space, that has been chosen by our curators as the title, so to say, of the exhibition, as the challenge to those who come, as a key to enter and understand and visit the whole exhibition. 2018 has been declared the Year of Heritage by the European Community. 2 years ago, the United Nations have approved new papers on the concept of heritage and the defense of heritage as one of the key new words for the Organization of International Right. So has free space and heritage, these two words, do they have something in common? Is there a relationship between the two? After all, they appear to be points of reference for any idea of planning or making projects. The free space, as we have discovered after the opening of the exhibition, that the word free space has an incredible number of definitions, incredible number of meanings in different countries, in different languages. And then we discovered that for the heritage is almost the same. So we are more or less like on top of a Babel tower, from which we have somehow to try to descend with some positive indication of where to go the next occasion. Free space and heritage tells us about one of the main wealth that architecture can bring and can produce. Something that goes beyond the sheer economics of building. Values, utilities that are not even taken into account when you make the balance sheet of a building. The utility of those who will walk in front of this building are not represented in the discussion about the budget and the project. The lived life of the city in which this building will, the building will enhance, excite, or is not considered when they make the decision. So the economics of architecture is made of two books. One is the economics of economics in terms of prices and costs, revealing all those values that can be exchanged in the market and are exchanged in the market. But there is a second book, a second chapter, that is more typical of architecture. Values and costs, indirect effects, subsequent future effects, future costs that are not taken into account when we talk about building. Here comes in the need of voices, the need of representation of these interests. Who is going to represent the future generation? Who is going to represent those who are going to live in the public space that will be left or not according to the demand for it in the city? Who is going to sustain the demand and request for values that architecture can give us, but architecture will not give us if we are not ready to ask, not ready to pretend or not ready to desire. Heritage. Is heritage the beginning? Something that has to be considered before thinking of a project, of a planning, of a plan? Or is heritage, after all, the final aim or end of any project? Since anything which is built has two different external effects. One is contributing to the creation of the free space which is outside and to become immediately part of the heritage for future generations. I'll stop here. These are questions that certainly will not have or possibly receive an answer today, but these are questions that I think that the Biennale of Architecture will keep for a sort of permanent debate on these subjects. There are two ways of stepping into the world of architecture. These are two doors that helps us really to understand much what architecture is, what architecture can do, and what we should do if we want architecture to be with us. I promise you that the Biennale will invite you in further occasions. These themes will all be at our attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paolo. So if I just take up from here, my name is Ricky Burdett. I'm from the London School of Economics. I'm absolutely delighted to be back in my second city, Venice, after London. It's becoming a habit, Paolo, to work together. It's the second occasion that Shelley McNamara and I are here already in these 3 months. And I have to say how extraordinary it is to walk down the Corderie and see it so full of people on a Saturday. This is what people want, culture, and sort of debate the issues that Paolo has talked about. We have an impossible task. We have 8 people to talk together with you in less than 2 hours about a subject which could, of course, open up many, many questions. So we have someone who pretends to be a president of the Biennale, but is actually, as you heard, an economist. Paolo, importantly, held several portfolios in the Italian governments of the past, very much dealing with these issues of value in the longer term. But we have together with us a number of individuals who represent very, very different aspects of making architecture, making space, making cities, and analyzing them. We have practitioners, we have architects, we have professors of specialist fields in art history, and many people who are involved in this interface between art, the production of the built environment, and the consumption of it, which is what is so important. In a moment, Shelley McNamara, who curated, as you well know, with Yvonne Farrelly from Grafton Architects, this, I think, incredibly powerful exhibition in the 2 locations, in the Giardini and here in the Arsenale, will in a way explain a little bit more what Paolo's already touched upon, of where free space and heritage maybe connect, and explain why 3 of the participants are in fact going to be here today to talk about their own work and their own ideas. So I'll let her say a little bit more about them. But we're going to start after that with 2 presentations going far out in terms of the experience of dealing with heritage. We have Abha, who has practiced intensely in India, has worked with UNESCO, and you'll see from her projects, is dealing with these very issues of, in the context of so many other big challenges. You know, where do you put your money? Do you put your money into a sewer, into a toilet, or into restoring a building? It's a big issue that we need to face. We have Fazal Georgis from Addis Ababa. We're working together on a project now. This is a city which is growing faster than any other city in the world except for 2 at the moment. So it's something like 4 million, and will be something like 10 million very, very soon. And how do you actually channel things? How do you channel growth without destroying the very essence of what that city is about, and with its only heritage in, which we see there. And if you use the word heritage and culture and institutions, particularly in Italy, but not only in Italy. There's no other name but Salvatore Setti's that comes up in terms of the significance of actually being a custodian of what it actually implies to preserve. And how do we modernize that thinking? And he'll be talking about those aspects. His background goes from running the Getty Museum in California to all sorts of other major posts across the world and in Italy, and we'll hear more about him. Cino, Elizabeth, and Andra are architects, artists, commentators who have exhibited in the show, and I'm going to therefore pass on to Shelley to just frame their work in the context of the exhibition. The methodology of today is very much in the style of a conversation at the here amongst us to a degree, as many people present. Some will stand and present from here using slides, have a conversation here, and if we have time, we'll have questions and answers with you from the floor. As you gather, we're speaking English. Potremmo parlare anche in italiano, però abbiamo scelto di parlare in inglese. If there are questions, se ci sono domande in italiano, we have translation, and that is obviously possible in the final stages of the conversation. When you do ask a question, can you please wait for the microphone, tell us who you are, and ask a question. Don't make a long statement. We're going to hear quite a few of them from over here. That would be beneficial. So, if I can now pass over to Shelley, and then we can start with the presentations in a moment. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you, Ricky. I'm just going to very briefly put today's session in the context of our idea of free space, and I know that many of people in the audience have not yet visited the Biennale or in the process. And just to say that when we received this wonderful invitation, the first thing we did was we came to Venice to see the two buildings that we're involved in, to see them empty. And we were determined from that moment on to make those buildings feel more present because of their difference and because of their power, especially the Corderie, to somehow take the heritage, the legacy of this city, and that these would be the first participants in our Biennale. When we were thinking about the manifesto which we had to write, our idea of free space was related to primarily things like the generosity of spirit and the sense of humanity, which we believe is the core of the agenda of, or the embodied value within architecture. We, in our documents to our participants, we asked people, invited people to deal with the unspoken wishes of strangers and how perhaps their work would embody this possibility. We asked them to think about how architecture deals with the free gifts of nature, of light, of wind, of air, and of resources, and our responsibility as architects dealing with these free and fragile gifts. We were very interested in projects which would describe spaces of opportunity or democratic space. And in relation to architecture itself, we really wanted to celebrate and to reveal what we believe to be the embodied power and beauty of architecture. And in relation to heritage, we didn't use that word actually in our manifesto, but we talked about the free space to imagine, but also the free space of time and memory, binding past, present, and future together, building on inherited cultural layers, weaving the archaic with the contemporary. And I think it's really interesting, actually, that Paolo Baratta raises the question, does heritage come at the beginning or at the end? I really like that as a question. It's not something we had thought about or considered, but it's very interesting to turn that question around, that heritage is a beginning and not an end, perhaps. In relation to the three participants here, we have Chino Zucchi. I'm going to finish with Chino, actually, for a reason. And we have Elizabeth Hatz. And we asked Elizabeth to do a very difficult thing, in a way, but something that was very important, which was to somehow map the history of drawing in architecture. Because we see the drawing as a kind of human thread of lines which connects past and present and future. And she made this wonderful room of a whole series of drawings, including her own, with an interpretation of free space, which was about somehow emphasizing spaces which could be appropriated, spaces which did not have defined or defensive edges. And you'll see that room in the central pavilion. But she also made some very provocative statements that free space somehow embodies a hidden contract with the outcast, with the most vulnerable, those who have no say. It carries, by necessity, a clandestine element of generosity, which we really enjoy that description or analysis of free space. And that was one of the wonderful things about being a curator, is you send out all these invitations and you get all these gifts back, these new interpretations. Andra Matan from Indonesia decided to respond to the part of the manifesto which deals with nature's free gifts and with the idea of the earth as client. And again, you'll see his piece in the Corderie, where he makes a beautiful woven structure, which is a prefabricated facade, which deals with his climate in this particular part of Indonesia. And he talks about the free space of the vernacular, that the vernacular allows architecture and people to grow naturally together, which in a way is again, is a very poetic description of vernacular, because it embodies an idea of time, and that it's not about speed, and that the vernacular is something that has perhaps another dimension of time. And Chino Zucchi paid homage, a wonderful celebration of the work of Caccia di Mignone, a really important Italian architect who I think affected certainly Grafton Architects when we discovered this work, which we didn't know, in Milan, and which has affected Chino Zucchi's work. And the way that he has represented this, he has the drawing of a terrazzo floor, which feels like a painting, which is this sinuous, beautiful drawing beside the plans of apartment buildings in Milan, which have the same sinuous quality, this organic, free, loose, kind of very poetic quality, and celebrates the work of this, what we feel, quite a unique architect, in that he has managed to bring the Baroque and the contemporary together, and celebrates it in a very particular way. And the reason why I wanted to finish with Chino is because right beside, or close by, is a room curated by Robert MacArthur, where he has presented an exhibition curated by Carlo Scarpa in the 70s, describing 4 unbuilt projects, one by Louis Kahn, one by Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Noguchi. And in that room, as part of the text, Scarpa is quoted as saying that Venice is the ideal city for the intervention of modern architecture, which really surprised me, because it's not the way that one feels Venice is thought about right now, that it is the ideal city for modern intervention. And perhaps it's very interesting to review Scarpa, who was a master of preservation, a master of the making of new buildings, and always what he did was alive. It wasn't frozen in time, and it's not dead, it's still alive. And Chino is one of the few people who has managed to build really good housing, new project in Venice. So that proximity we found really interesting. So I'm looking forward to hearing They're not speaking about their exhibits, I think, today, but I think it's a fantastic group of people, which I can't take credit for bringing together. It was a combination of Ricky and the president. And I'm really curious and interested to see how the bigger view and maybe the more particular views will come together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Thank you. And I think, going back, Paolo, to your point earlier, you know, the benefit of having these presentations is that you can go back and look at these exhibits, perhaps with a sort of different lens and a greater sort of depth. So if we start with the first presentations, Abha Narain Lamba, as you will hear, has worked extensively in her own practice, but also been on various committees in Delhi and Mumbai to do with really preserving and thinking about preservation and heritage as such, but I can assure you not in the conventional sense. We have a common friend, Rahul Mehrotra, who was also part of this exhibition, and they've worked in the past together. So it's a great pleasure to have Abha here in Venice. Will you welcome Abha? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, hello, and thank you, Ricky and Paolo, for inviting me here. And thank you, Shelley, for coming up with this amazing term, free space, because it has so many connotations, it has so many interpretations. And from my point of view, the kind of work I work in and the space I work in India, to me, free space and heritage are two words that sometimes converge and sometimes diverge, and they create amazing patterns. And my understanding of free space in heritage is really what people understand is not private, gated, and exclusive, but what belongs to the community. And the last 25 years of my life, I think I've made attempts at working in this relationship, in this sort of tenuous relationship, this landscape of urban heritage, of rural heritage, but definitely heritage that is considered to be not belonging to one, but to a larger group of people. And for that reason, I feel that free space and heritage is a lot about identity, because there are old buildings and you can forget about them, you can pass by, you can think of demolishing them, you think of them as dead structures. But what makes an old space, an old building, an old area, a historic precinct or a quarter really special is when people begin to draw their identity from it, or when they are able to identify, and that makes it, that gives it a value, and that, to my mind, is really free space and heritage. I'll take you to this project, for example, I worked on 14 years ago. It's in the northernmost part of India, in Ladakh. It's at 11,000 feet height, a dry, cold desert, and this was a 15th century Buddhist temple that I was commissioned as an architect to restore. It was on the most endangered list of monuments by World Monuments Fund. But what was truly special was that it did not, my client was not government, it was not a monastery that owned the temple, but it was the local villagers. It's a small village called Basgo, which at that point, 14 years ago, had no electricity, there were no cell phone connections, we did not even have toilets. We had a hole in the floor, and that was a dry toilet. But this was so special because for the conservation of this monument, which was endangered, it was a mud structure from the 15th century, the villagers had signed up an agreement with the World Monuments Fund, and under a matching grant had pledged 50% of World Monuments Fund dollars to be matched by their local material and their labor free of cost. And for that reason, it's not moving. Okay.
Not working. Possiamo vedere se vediamo un po'.
Okay. It works now. And as you could see here, you would have people making human chains to take the material up the mountain. And that was happening purely because that temple to them gave them a sense of identity, and they were able to consider that not as a temple or a site that belonged to one, but belonged to the whole community. So we began a process, a 3-year process of conserving the site, because the temple was completely inaccessible in the winter period because the roads were shut down, there was no access, and we could work every year between May and October, and then we would close up the site for the year and start the next year again. And it began with this wonderful ceremony, because the temple, the inside of the temple had a 3-storied high mud image of the Buddha. And before the work began, it was deconsecrated. So this is a beautiful ceremony where the monks came and trapped the soul of the Buddha in silk and wrapped it around, and then it was deconsecrated and we could walk in with our labor. But the great thing is that the project had absolutely no specialists, there were no contractors, there were only local villagers who were both client as well as contractors as well as labor. And other than me and my team that were qualified architects, everyone else was a local. So we used local material. Every villager has a willow tree growing in his garden, and from that they gave the wood. They gave the old men knew more about the local materials, so there were 5 types of clays, zasal, and these clays had different properties. So we were using local materials, local traditional both understanding and local knowledge for conservation. And eventually, after a 3-year period, this project was completed and it went on to win a UNESCO Award of Excellence. But the point here being that this was considered important because this was the space of the community, and every community ritual, every community ceremony was happening here, and that's what gave value to this project and this site. Another site, like a completely different one, is the case of Punjab. The part of when India received independence, it was fragmented, divided into 2 countries, and Punjab was the region that was literally split into 2, and half of it went to Pakistan and half to India, which also led to the greatest migration of people in history. And with partition came a whole lot of terrible memories that people didn't want to remember. And then what do you do with buildings or architecture that actually reminds you of something you don't want to think about? And that's what happened with this mosque, which is the Moorish mosque in Kapurthala, a tiny town in Punjab, which originally had a large Muslim population, but with the creation of Pakistan, they had all moved out. And here was this mosque, which for 70 years was lying desolate because there were no people to actually come and pray in it. There were no Muslims left in that area. And for 70 years, the scars of partition were so terrible and painful that nobody wanted to look at it. And after 70 years, we worked on the conservation of this project. But what had happened in the last 70 years was that the whole generation of local builders, craftsmen, had forgotten about conservation because Punjab almost set its mind to forget the past and looked at itself as a state that was progressive, looked at agriculture, industry, and just tried to forget about its cultural heritage. And after 70 years, if you can see the old men here in the picture, the one to the left is the grandson of Maharaja Jagatjit Singh, the king of Kapurthala, who had commissioned the monument, who had childhood memories of the colors, the paints, the materials. And in the middle was this 85-year-old man who was a master craftsman who did remember how to slate lime and how to use to actually work on the traditional craft skills. And it was this generation, the last generation to survive and to remember, that we used to train the next generation and the young craftsmen in restoring this building. And today it is restored and it is back to what it was. But therefore, sometimes free space is not just about keeping a memory alive, but trying to sometimes pull back a memory that had been consciously forgotten or suppressed. And then coming to the memory of an identity of a city. This is Jaipur, a very bustling city, the walled city of Jaipur. It's a, it has a lot of UNESCO World Heritage sites. But then what do you do about a city that is choked with traffic and people refuse to go there? So the idea was to create an underground metro line, and the whole idea of this tunnel boring machine going through under the city was so scary that people began to, create a big furor. We were appointed as conservation architects to look at the central core, which is a chopper. And this was like a fountain that was not ever in use, and it was like a municipal garden. But then when we started looking at old photographs, we found that, wait a minute, this looks like a step well. And this was a photograph from 1860s. And for the last 150 years, nobody knew that there was a step well. So we changed the entire design of the underground metro line. The station was pulled back 6 meters down. We did an archaeological exercise, and we found the step well. We found the marble cows from which water would have spewed out. And then this was restored in August this year and put back. But what it did back to create a free space for the city, because what was then a roundabout has come back to being a kind of an amphitheater for culture, for the city to regain its open space. And that led to a series of, this is the 15th of August, Indian Independence Day this year, and the whole city spilled out onto this square with buildings being lit up. And I end with my city, Bombay. This was inscribed this year by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. And this is the Oval Maidan with the series of Victorian Gothic buildings on one end and Art Deco. And Indian conservation, the dialogue has been very monument-centric because we've only looked at ancient, medieval, dead sites, palaces, forts, tombs. So the idea was almost considered bizarre to list living buildings, apartment blocks, 20th century and 19th century buildings. And it took me 10 years to convince the government and the Indian government, for starters, to be able to list this. But this is free space because this has these areas, urban quarters, that were restored purely by citizen funding. This was less than 6,000 euros spent on this facade by citizens just to clean up the city, and without a penny of government funding. And now you have, things like coming up together. This is Kala Ghoda, which was a group of citizens. We got together in '98, and we did a little, survey of the area, which was lying sort of desolate. And we just asked the government, not for a penny, but asked them to make this a free space for contemporary art. And we've used up every square inch. The parking lot becomes, a gallery. We've used pavements for art. We've called all the greatest artists of India to perform here. And that money then gets plowed back into restoring the built heritage, not with a penny of government funding, but because we believe that these facades form part of the public realm. So even if they're privately owned building, it affects the city and the citizens' idea of free space. And then we gradually started looking inside the buildings and removing just layers of add-ons to just expose what the buildings were meant to be. And today, for the last 18 years, the Kala Ghoda Art Festival is a citizen initiative at taking back from these cordoned off spaces what the city truly deserves, and to give back to the citizens an open space where they can enjoy their own city, treat it like a cultural venue. So the steps of the Asiatic Library, which is a library, form the basis for a rock concert at night and for children's activities in the morning. And the library, which just had become bureaucratic and governmentalized with steel cupboards, has then been restored through government and citizen participation to restore it back to what it should have been. So I think really free space is not just, to my mind, free space and heritage are important because they don't belong to it's not like one palace or a great villa belonging to a billionaire for his private indulgence. It's something what belongs to all of us. And only when citizens and all of us feel a sense of connect with a part of heritage do we feel that we need to do something to save it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abba. Thank you. Fazal, if you want to go. We'll come back, Abba, to this key point about identity, because I think... Hold on a sec. Otherwise, let's have Fazal and then we'll have questions together. Yeah? Fazal is going to, I mean, it's interesting, in this presentation, we've already gone through enormous change of scale from city level down to detail. Fazal is dealing very much with these issues of scale, I think, in your city, where the question of heritage at the moment is very low down the political agenda, and there are interesting correlations between what Abbas explained, and in particular in Mumbai over the years, how it's sort of come up, but through a very interesting political process of ownership and civic engagement. Fazal has the chair of of conservation and urban heritage at the University of Addis Ababa, has built extensively in that city, and has written the most authoritative book on the heritage of Addis Ababa. Will you welcome Fazal Giorgis?
Yeah, thank you for the organizers for inviting me to speak. It's for an African to come and speak in Europe, it's always a rare chance. So, and also to share what's going on in that continent in terms of urban planning, heritage, and architecture is a chance. And yesterday I had the privilege of going through the exhibit with Shelley, which I enjoyed very much, and this was a great opportunity for me. So thank you for inviting me to speak. Well, I will go straight to Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa is the capital of a country of 106 million people in the northeastern part of Africa. And it's an old country. It has 9 World Heritage Sites. There are 2 countries in Africa, Morocco and Ethiopia, who have 9 World Heritage Sites. And by heritage, for the leadership, for the politicians, and for the business community, and for the elite, heritage ends up in the few heritage sites we have. Like the Yihad, this is the oldest built structure in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. It's 2,800 years old. And also you have the Steles of Aksum. I think in Italy, you know the return of the obelisk. So this is another World Heritage Site. We also have an old Islamic city in the east, which is called Harar, which is recently, some years ago, which is inscribed as the World Heritage City. And then we have the Rock-hewn, I think these are the most famous, the Rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, which are also very, fascinating, a different kind of architecture, where space was excavated from a solid rock. And then you have the castles of Gondar, where I was born. I was born in this city. And there is an imperial compound in the center of the city. And then we have some vernacular, let's say, cultural landscapes, the Konso cultural landscape, which is also part of the inscribed World Heritage Site, with a society that lives in a very dense situation, 4,000 people, more than 4,000 people living in a rural but kind of urban. You know, we do not have to see urban only from the Western point of view. This is also one of our arguments. And then you have, those were the World Heritage Sites. But we have a lot of places which have identity, as Abha was saying, the identity which is recognized by the people, and sometimes also neglected and not understood by the, let's say, Western educated elite class of our countries. And then I come to Addis Ababa, the capital, which is, as Ricky was saying earlier, 4.5, getting close to 4.5 million people. And then this city is a young city compared to in our history. It's 130 years old. It was founded in the latter part of the 19th century. And we have wooden stone architecture, which was built in those days from a combination of Indian, Armenian, and other influences, but an architecture that has identified itself as local. This is one of the historic buildings that we lost recently due to real estate development. And then that is really the most, let's say, devastating kind of effect when we come to urban heritage. You see, the old areas of our city is considered to be, in the words of UN Habitat, slum area, shanty town, and so on. But within these areas, you have places where people have built up a lifestyle and an intangible culture, a relationship, a communal relationship. And what is special about these places is that people of different income live together, and it has created a relatively, let's say, calm and very harmonious lifestyle. The crime rate in these areas are incredibly low because of the mixity of the society. So you don't only have the tangible, the concrete built-up heritage, but also the relationship which is found in the neighborly social fabric and so on. What is going on now, because this city is growing very fast and the government wants to develop, to progress so fast that these areas are completely erased with no trace. So the picture above shows you how it was 10 years ago, and now it's completely erased. We call it tabula rasa. No trace of the urban fabric. Well, I am, as was mentioned earlier, I'm an instructor, a teacher, and we are extremely worried about this phenomenon. So we go around trying to study, to understand what lies behind. Are there historic buildings, buildings from the foundation of the city? Are there places people could identify with, and so on? These are interests that we have, and this, of course, talking as an architect, I do not only talk to architects and my colleague professionals, but I also talk to anthropologists and other people in the social sciences. And that informs me that we as designers of space or space makers, we do not understand another dimension of the human condition. There are things that we do not actually see, or well, when we are sensitive, we are a bit lucky we can see, but there's a whole area that we need to learn about how people live. And writers are now writing about this disaster and so on. So I take you to the space that I had the opportunity to talk. This is the Meskel Square, the square where a lot has happened. This is in the center of the city. It's a vast area, and it has lived its life. It's a space where serious cultural and political events take place. So this space is used for religious activities like the Meskel celebration, which is a very important celebration. It has been registered, this event has been registered as intangible culture for UNESCO. And then there are infrastructure works that come in to solve or to, let's say, to bring in modernity or progress in the city. So I had the chance to work on this site. Some years ago, about 15 years ago, a group of people who wanted to do a monument for the people who lost their life during the military dictatorship. Thousands of young people were killed for political opposition, and a group which was formed after the fall of the military regime started working on remembering the memory of these young people. And the idea was to build a monument right in the center of this space. So when they called me and another artist, we said, my God, they're going to destroy the best city, the best part of our city, for good intentions. They did not want to destroy it, but just they wanted to do something which they did not realize the importance of this public space. So we had to fight, and suddenly I found myself both as an architect proposing a project and also a client. You know, I had to play this role because I became a member of the committee, but also the architect. And what happened was that we had to, I came up with this idea of a museum that should be built there to remember, instead of this Soviet kind of 40-meter high statue, I proposed to build a museum. But the design of the museum was not like what we do normally in my country. I proposed a building which is low, which kind of fits with the surrounding and continues the amphitheater space of the public space. So there is a museum to remember or to educate tolerance and so on. So the value of the heritage that's being experienced by everyday people in the public space, that is a very strong aspect of life of people. This is where they come and run in the morning. This is where they sit. So as an architect, I have to respect and find a continuity. So reused the stone which was there and created something which retraced the original line and so on. So people could literally, yes, walk on the roof of this building, and the inclined dark gray building is the museum, and these are supporting facilities. So this place has now become an integral part of the corner of this city, and people go in and out, and it is very much welcoming, and it has become like a landmark in the corner. And a few years later, I had the chance to do a restoration, not a new design, the restoration of a museum, which is maybe 50 meters at the top of that museum. And the response was, okay, let's restore this wooden late 19th century building. But I stressed the importance of creating a public space that would have a dialogue with the existing Meskel Square. And what happened was this space became a venue for people just to sit and watch and experience and enjoy a park in the middle of the city. So finally, you see this kind of space was created, and people now come there just to read, to sit and watch the city. So the heritage, the urban space as heritage of the city was further enriched, and I was trying to protect, in the sense to protect it from development that is very prevalent in this city, and make it as a dynamic, but also as a most visited place, and people would appreciate the meaning of heritage. But this heritage that I'm talking about is not necessarily monuments and so on, but public spaces that are part of the fabric of social life of the city. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, I mean, we'll just have a few comments on these two presentations. I mean, Paolo, just thinking of Fazl's project, is that the end, or is that are we celebrating the end, or are we celebrating the beginning? Clearly, we're celebrating the beginning of what is. I've been there. I've witnessed what this place is like. It's the Piazza San Marco of Addis Ababa. We have to think of it in that way. It's used in that way, but in a different circumstance, and it's just as powerful in terms of what it means. Paolo.
No, I wanted just to underline. I am, as you can understand, in these years have become rather idiosyncratic to the word identity. Identity is a wonderful thing and a nightmare at the same time. It's a tool for a defensive attitude, and at the same time for improving our possibilities of dialogue. So I just wanted to tell you that while seeing these images and seeing both of you have been showing, I am quite happy that we have chosen these two words, free space and heritage, and not identity. Because my feeling looking at your efforts and your choices and your work is that that heritage belongs also to me. And through your efforts, you are reducing the potential, the negative potential of the word identity, and increasing the sort of the concept of identity in much wider sense that can include me. The effort we feel while taking care of free space, while taking care of heritage, we are really building a new world community. So that were signs of identity. They used to be. But once they have been rethought, brought back to life, they have become part of the world community. And I'm afraid to say that I really feel as being an inhabitant of Addis Ababa or an Indian city from now onwards.
Let's hear. Yeah.
Do you
On
want
this
me?
point, yeah.
Paolo, good to know that we're on the same side for once. but seriously, I think what has happened for very long is that identity is both. It can be uniting and divisive, and that's been played politically, to no end across the world, and we've seen that. But I think what most of us are trying to do in this, in this minefield and negotiating our own spaces, are trying to figure out that even if there is a building or an architectural monument that does not necessarily remind me of my identity, it is a very important aspect of my past and therefore my national identity. And sometimes that past may not be a very happy past, maybe a forgettable past, but you cannot forget history because you are then forced to repeat it. And I think that, that the project, the Kapurthala Mosque that we were working on, we were all very conscious of the fact that it represented that really dark chapter in Indian history when people had to leave their homes and vice versa. The Hindus had to leave Pakistan and the Muslims had to leave India. And that was a very negative connotation, but we all agreed that even if that mosque just had one person who would come to worship it, that was part of our history and our past that we had to conserve.
Faisal, on this point?
Yes, I think it's extremely important that people understand. I mean, we had terrible pasts. We had terrible things that has happened in colonial, post-colonial situations. But when people are allowed to experience, to enter, what is really negative is when people are prohibited from accessing these spaces. I can give the example of Eritrea, Asmara, which was built under colonial conditions. During the colonial times in the 1930s, the ordinary African, the Eritreans, were not allowed in some parts of the city. But when independence came, when they appropriated these spaces, when they started enjoying the public streets and so on, it became their own. They owned it. And now it has become part of their identity. So access and then relationship with these spaces is extremely important. People need to be allowed. If we make gated communities, we are creating this division still. So we should allow people to be close to these spaces and buildings.
Shelley, you may want to comment on this?
I think what you're speaking about, both of you, is one of the most difficult things to do as an architect, which is to make space that people connect with. I actually quite like the word identity because we have to remember that sometimes people don't know how to connect or what to connect with. And actually, Paolo, it's one of the things you raised in discussions with us, is how do people know what they're missing, which is architecture and civic space of quality, unless we show people what they can have. And I think that's a really laudable ambition of the Biennale, to raise people's expectations of what architecture can do for them, and that they can take ownership of it, or start to feel an ownership and connection with it.
Okay, I think Elizabeth and Salvatore want to say something about this, so go ahead.
Is this on? Yeah.
Yeah.
Two things. Actually, I catch on where Paolo was, because I had the same kind of feeling when you talk, because there's this dual. But I think the wonderful and hopeful, fantastic thing about architecture is that it can still talk to us, it can still receive us, it can still engage us and raise our desires when we have lost the code, the culture code, and also the political memory. And I think that is something absolutely wonderful and hopeful in terms of the global change. Because if that, so I have that same feeling and that same kind of ambiguous relationship to the word identity. But there was then another thing that came to my mind when you talked, Vasil, which is a really, really interesting presentation, was that how do you ever, and I think this is maybe one of the most difficult things, don't we have to sometimes say, we're not going to build? Mm-hmm. Right. That's the hardest thing for an architect to make that decision. But I think it's something that will have to come, actually. And well, so I stop there.
Salvatore, on this point?
Thank you. I actually agree with Paolo about the word identity and its tricky nature. We can't forget that we are speaking in a world in which there is somebody saying America first and somebody else saying prima gli italiani. This is some sort of exclusive idea of identity that is certainly not what ABBA had in mind. I think the real beauty of ABBA's presentation was in actually pointing to a concept of identity that points rather to cultural memory and to intergenerational cultural memory. So when you were presenting first, I don't remember the place names, I'm sorry about that, but when you were talking about the Buddhist sanctuary where people would offer themselves and their work as matching funds. That's one thing. And in the mosque, the 85-year-old person who knew about building techniques, that's intergenerational memory, and that's a sort of identity that is simultaneously local and global. And I think that this is the cultural identity we have to argue for, rather than America first, or even worse, prima gli italiani.
We will come back to some of these issues. I think a note for all of us is that the fact that we're talking about this issue of memory and access in the context of objects or non-objects presupposes total access and openness. And I think this is something that actually, as things become memorialized, they become less accessible and more closed up. So I think there's that issue. The second issue which struck me is that you both talked about the discovery of depth of meaning and history in the process of modernization of your cities. Quite brutal modernization. The motorway cutting across Mescal Square, San Marco, Piazza San Marco of Ades, is pretty brutal stuff. But on the other hand, you've been able to sort of amplify the experience through that. Okay. So we're now going to move to Salvatore. Are you going to speak from here? Yeah, so please join us. I already mentioned that Salvatore is an art historian. Literally, if I wanted to list the major institutions in the world that shape culture and heritage and everything else, he's a member of it, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei, and he was also responsible for the High Council for Cultural Heritage and Landscape. He's also on the Scientific Committee of the Louvre. I could go on, but we don't have time. It's wonderful you're here.
You
Welcome,
much.
Salvatore, anyway.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm very glad to be here in such a good company, and thank you all for being here and for listening to what we have to say. And free space. So free space is a very nice keyword. And we all have to thank the Venice Biennale and Paolo Baratta particularly for having chosen this topic for our meeting this afternoon. And I don't want to repeat what Paolo just said, but this is a good subject, the subject of the relationship between free space and heritage. But what do we mean by free space? What do we mean by heritage? Does free space coincide as a notion with public space or not? What about heritage? Cultural heritage? Does cultural heritage coincide with public space or not? Now on the screen, I will come back to this point, but on the screen, please note that with my title, you have 4 pictures after a German book of late 15th century, 4 pictures, 4 identical pictures, supposedly representing Damascus, Mantua, Perugia, and Verona as identical cities. So I will come back to this. But let's think for a minute that there was somebody in 1490 something who actually printed a book in which Damascus and Mantua were conceptually identical. Let's think about it for a minute. The difference among different traditions, even within Europe, are great in order to address these notions. Differences are cultural, but also are more specifically legal. Continental Europe is based basically on Roman law, while the UK and the United States are based on common law, totally different, with very little in common tradition. But what I want to do today is to focus on the Italian tradition, or rather the contribution of the Italian experience to this subject matter. And I mean Italy long before it was a unified country. And I don't want to draw conclusions. I only want to offer some food for thought. On the screen you see the Buon Governo in Siena, a comparatively early conception of citizenship as linked to a republican set of rules. So Buon Governo, good government, implies a good city and a good landscape around it. 2 main points are very clear here. The clear distinction between city and countryside, a sharp distinction, and a sharp opposition between buon governo and cattivo governo, with the consequences. The buon governo has a good countryside, while the cattivo governo has a bad countryside. Another important point in the Italian model, let me put it this way, is the relative continuity. You see here the walls of the city, separating very clearly the city itself from its countryside, and we can see that the situation didn't change so much, at least in Siena. If we move to different Italian cities, a couple of examples on the screen, you can see a number of features that are clearly peculiar to the Italian system. First and foremost, a hierarchy of spaces and of their distinctive functions, which is what Henri Lefebvre called la production de l'espace, the production of social space, resulting from economic, political, and cultural processes, guidelines that combine to alter the balance between the public and the private, the secular and the religious, the functional and the symbolic. Urban spaces, that's a very important characteristic of the Italian tradition. Urban spaces both surround and shape the body of the citizen. The body of the city and the body of the citizen are mutually influencing one another. And this means that we are talking about the essentially political nature of urban and not urban space. And what do we mean by political? I mean, I use the word in its original etymological sense. Political comes from Greek polis, i.e. city, i.e. a community. So political means primarily, to my mind, the relationship between citizens and their city before the politics as la politique politicienne of those who do politics as a job. Now, the basically eminent domain of the city and of the state, be it republican or not, is a characteristic of Italian history, even when there was a king, or the equivalent of a king, a prince, a king, a pope. And I can only mention one example, a very influential law by Pope Gregory XIII in 1574, whereby he very clearly, based on Roman law, established the primacy of what he called bonum commune and of public spaces above private greed and gains, cupiditates et commoda of private citizens. So this is very much part of the Italian tradition. And when we speak now of new legal notions such as the right of future generations, we have to keep in mind that the right of future generations is a new formulation of what was called bonum comune in the constitutions of Italian comuni. Yet, in Italy as elsewhere, such an ancient model of urban space is threatened, indeed is being tendentially demolished by the apparent predominance of a globalized, or rather homogenized model of urban development. And I'm only mentioning the main characteristics of three main components: the rhetoric of the skyscraper and the verticalization of space, which is by definition a private space, because nobody can build such a skyscraper if not with an immense private wealth. The megalopolis, or the urban sprawl, urban conglomeration where public space is either missing or it has a residual status, space left over. Marc Augé's non-lieu, junk space, we can call it in different ways. Even more worrying, there is a third component, the social divide, as exemplified even in prosperous European countries, such as on the example on the screen, but even more so in a number of countries. So we are assisting now worldwide at the contemporary formation and increasing growth of two opposing formations: favelas or shanty towns on one hand, and gated communities on the other hand. Two complementary formations of our time. 1 billion people is living in shanty towns now in our planet. So what happens is that the boundaries of the city, so clearly defined in the Buon Governo in Siena, the boundaries of the city, are becoming the boundaries within the city. This is the favela of Paraisópolis in São Paulo in Brazil, where I've been a few weeks ago. And so I will not elaborate on what you are seeing on the screen. I can only tell you that when I first saw this photograph, I thought it was made with Photoshop, but it is real. I've been there. Let me show now on the screen the Acropolis of Athens, invariably conceived as a totally free space for citizens. And the Acropolis with the Agora in the Greek city is one of the main spaces of the polis, i.e. the place for politei, or citizens. This means that politics needs free space. This doesn't necessarily mean that Athenian democracy is like ours, because in Athenian democracy, women didn't vote and they were slaves. So it's a totally different conception of democracy, yet it's where the word comes from. Gubbio is an example of Italian comune, and finally Venice as a republican state ruled by aristocracy, but where nobody can doubt that Piazza San Marco is a free space or a public space. What is now for us a public space? That's the question. Should such a notion be inspired by generosity of those supposedly private and wealthy members of a given community who own that space, and then they benevolently concede the use of that space to the rest of the world? Or rather, should the free space be granted as a right, as linked to citizenship by a set of rules? If we look at these four identical images, we think, first of all, I think somebody among you will think about the comment by Gombrich when he said, well, they didn't care very much about the difference between cities. Now, only the peripheries of the city are so similar. But there is something more. If this four and more identical picture could be used for very different cities, it is because there was an idea of a city, an iconic idea. This was a hieroglyph for city. A city was a community with walls around, and with a clear separation. So I think that this is what we have to think about. And my last point, and I'm coming to my last point, we need rules. We need a legal definition. We can conceptualize as much as we want, But until we don't have rules, we will never be able to create a truly free space and a truly public space. Interestingly, the idea of putting the protection of public space in a constitution in a contemporary state has 100 years, only 100 years. The first constitution was the one in the Weimar Constitution, die Denkmäler der Kunst, der Geschichte und der Natur. The second was the Spanish Constitution, toda la riqueza artística e histórica del país, tesoro cultural de la nación. And the third was the Italian Constitution, la Repubblica tutela il paesaggio e il patrimonio storico artistico della nazione. Think about the dates. Not just about the differences in languages, which I could elaborate for a long time about, but think about the dates. The Weimar Constitution, immediately afterwards, the defeat of Germany in World War I. The Spanish Constitution, immediately before the Civil War. The Italian Constitution, immediately afterwards, when Italy was in ruins after World War II. So why don't we think that in some cases, the trauma of a destruction can trigger a reaction which might also be positive. Let me quote from Orhan Pamuk. It seems that there is no way we can discover the secret of objects without heartbreak, and we must humbly submit to the truth of this ultimate secret. I think that this is true for individuals as well as for communities. And the movement for constitution, for putting in constitution, I'm showing you a chart of Europe and Latin America that shows that the movement for the right of the city is just distributing itself throughout the world, as theorized after Lefebvre, particularly by David Harvey in his famous book Rebel Cities 2013. With different languages and so forth. Now, just to finish, let me allow a little coda about Venice. In Venice, the boundaries between the city and the rest of the world is very clear. There is no countryside, but there is the lagoon. But many people living in Venice, or particularly in Mestre or Marghera or elsewhere, don't understand the real nature of the relationship between the lagoon and the city itself, though it was constantly represented, as shown in this wonderful painting in Eton College that derives from the famous and very early bird-eye view of Venice by Jacopo de Barbari in 1500. Venice is a quintessential embodiment of the generalized acqua alta phenomenon. We are going to a world which risks to be submerged by acqua alta, whatever President Trump might say about it. And nonsensical statements about climate change are not changing the climate change, which is a fact. And yet, let me remind you how careful about itself Venice has historically been. In this wonderful painting in Philadelphia, you don't see just the Ducal Palace or the Campanile di San Marco. You can notice that a corner of the Campanile is damaged because there was a lightning a few days before. So there is a lightning, and immediately afterwards Cavaletto paints the Campanile di San Marco with this little damage that was corrected a few days afterwards. And then you see a relatively big ship in front of the Bucintoro, in front of Palazzo Ducale. Big ships now are destroying this city, and they are a symbol of modernity and actually deprive both Venetians and honorary Venetians, as we all are here, of the very nature and beauty of the public space. So how much should we trust in icons of modernization, and how much should we try to reconstruct within our brains the hieroglyphs of a city, be it Damascus or Verona, that was represented by a German engraver in 1590-something.
Thank you very much. I mean, there is a wonderful link between those drawings, amazing drawings from 500, 600 years ago, to Elizabeth's presentation and her exhibit here, in terms of the significance and power of the drawing itself. But I mean, I think, Salvatore, just a reminder that form, governance, and legislation are actually at the heart of this discussion is incredibly powerful. We'll come back to that. Elizabeth already has been introduced a little bit. The main thing is that she's a literally multicultural artist, activist, architect, and many other things, working both in Stockholm but also teaching and practicing in Ireland, therefore in a wonderful position to look at this issue from different angles. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Could you welcome her?
Thank you, Ricky. So what is heritage? We normally use the word, of course, to designate something old and something valuable, but I think our discussion so far has pointed towards that this might be too narrow. How old does it have to be, and how do we realize and define its value? And actually what you said earlier and what I already had in my presentation, potentially all we have built is our heritage, and probably infinitely much, much more would be worth and needs our consideration and re-evaluation to be brought up, to be brought into this category of heritage. So whenever we build something, it potentially becomes heritage, and it is also altering the existing heritage. And I think that is a mindset, actually, that can go quite deep. And it means that we need to negotiate these values of heritage over and over again in order to reappropriate them. So it's like no virgin territory. There isn't anywhere that we could call nowhere. No empty sheet of paper, no clear screen. So maybe we need to know a lot more about all our heritage, all that we build, all that is already there, and maybe shift the meaning of the word heritage. And also, if you think of that, an increasing amount of architectural tasks ahead might also be not just about building new, but actually to take care of the existing, to alter it, to reuse it. This actually presents quite a creative challenge to a very ingrained modernistic belief in progress as the ultimate salvation. I've always been interested in something that we could call potential architecture. Spaces that seem to me to have some special presence that maybe also could be enhanced, lifted, and cared for, and also altered. This happens to be a development outside Limerick that was meant to be the largest shopping mall in Northern Europe. And it's still in this state. It's been in this state since 2007, I think. And this could be one of these areas where I would be interested in seeing, is this also part of our heritage that could be enhanced? But it requires quite a different mindset to think about altering architecture and not just creating new. And it's quite a different mindset from what we're living through now, and which has been dominating for a long time, where we actually think that we need to obliterate, to make a kind of tabula rasa in order to be creative and innovative. I think architects have that kind of bad heritage, actually, of thinking that it's what Adam Caruso calls the tyranny of newness. But perhaps the condition of our planet, and we really do have to wake up to face it. That might actually require a total change also of our mindsets. And sometimes the hardest might mean actually to not to build, the decision not to build. No. Yeah. I can't say that I'm very optimistic about change. As the Finnish philosopher Georg Henrik von Wright, who had the chair after Wittgenstein at Cambridge, he actually wrote a provocative book called The Myth of Progress that I can recommend. He pointed out that probably only major catastrophes might make people and leaders think differently. And I think today, even that is a bit hard to hope for somehow, if you follow me, if you think of Brazil and what is happening now. And still, it has to happen. And I think what I want to talk to you about and with you about is, for architecture, I think some of that change has to start with the work process itself, how we live and work. Because architecture is a very physical art. And I wonder, how can you design spaces, rooms inside and outside? And as we know that free space, the outside rooms are crucial for creating that. How can you design if you don't spend enough time looking at what is there? How can you know how light and shadow actually act on built materials? How they create places where we want to stay, how they create microclimate. I think we need to, the change that we could do as architects is to spend a lot more time outdoors instead of inside our offices, in front of our screens. I think that is one of the changes that has to happen in order to face the condition that we're in. Because how can you design also better and improve your design without going back and really looking and reassessing what you have designed and what is already built? How often do we design real rooms, is my question. Or does it just become forms, surfaces, images? Obviously not what we have seen today, the presentations. It's something very real. And these presentations, you can feel that the people have been there and looked. So what I suggest is sit down, take it easy for a while, steal that time to take it easy, let your gaze drift around without thoughts. You wait until there is that emptiness, and that emptiness allows you to really start seeing again. Because if you, as an architect, cannot see in your everyday life, how can you create rooms or alter existing ones? I actually started teaching because I was frustrated by the way that architecture was done in most offices. All too often, plans became kind of divisions of areas rather than being that tool for a sophisticated exploring of spatial relations and rooms, to create rooms as background for something that is more important, which is life itself. So we have to find ways to halt the routine and to break out of our comfort zones. And this is where I think that the hand drawing could make a difference, does make a difference. It's more physical. It can make you see. It can actually make you think and study. And I'll come back to that because I think that maybe is the most important. But it can also force us out back into reality. It's both quick, but above all, it actually changes our environment of working and our mindset, because it makes us more focused. It also makes us more receptive. And maybe that per se is a way of transforming time, because you become more present and therefore more reflective in front of what you see. So the hand drawing might actually come back, and it's already happening at some bolder schools of architecture, and there are offices who never stop hand drawing as part of the process, which I think is interesting. I had two Swiss architects coming to my Irish students just a few days ago with all their hand drawings, who are not well-known architects but are brilliant architects. And there's a great little film that I can also recommend called Drawing on Life by Paul Clark in Belfast. And it also features our Biennale curators, Shelley McNamara and Yvonne Farrell, and how they work as architects. And it's deeply instructive. And for my last shot, sorry, I must have jumped one, sorry. Did you see this one? Good. So, if there were quite a lot of response and actually reactions to the exhibitions of drawings in room 11, I think it is because they contain an awful lot of information, and they contain stories, and they're actually so full with knowledge and with skill and personal thoughts and doubts and dreams, and it speaks to anyone. So the guards, when we were putting up the exhibition, my son and myself and two Ukrainians, the guards started to look at them and ask, what's that? So actually, it's about the personal commitment. And you can't escape that. So we need actually to steal more time to reflect. And that's my last point, because we can also dig around in archives, which is another heritage, and to rediscover some of all that knowledge that has accumulated over time, and that is absolutely, totally dead unless we revalue it, look at it again, anew, and reappropriate it. It's a very long and ongoing process, and we are not at all the first ones to do it, and hopefully not the last, because I think in the end, why would we do that? Because it creates reflection, and reflection opens for understanding and for negotiation. If you understand more, you're more ready to negotiate, and even negotiate your own standpoint. And for me, these are keywords in free space seen as a way to escape and refuse business as usual, and also our very locked way of working as architect. With Hannah Arendt, we could talk about free space, the space of the acting persons who has a consciousness. And I'm in deep debt to Drawing Matter Archive, without which my exhibition would not have been possible to make, and which is precisely one of these places where the search is going on relentlessly and very inventively. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for these two powerful presentations. You could hear the silence in the room, which was quite important. President Barat, I'm taking an executive decision, which is dangerous with you here, that we're going to go on a little bit more than 4:30. Otherwise, we're not going to finish. So please bear with us. We'll go on another 10 minutes after the supposed time that we end. So we'll get everyone's presentations. Paolo.
No, go on. No, go on with them.
Right. So, Shelley, did you just want to comment on what's just been said? Take the microphone, though, please.
Well, not really. I'd love to keep going, because I'm kind of intrigued, and it's building up to an interesting combination, maybe at the end.
Okay,
I'm really enjoying
Very good. So,
these presentations.
fine. Okay, so can we now go straight to the next presentation? So, Adrien, if you could come up to the platform. Adrien Martin, as you heard from Shelley, has a beautiful exhibition in the Corderia. He's a practicing architect based in, again, one of the world's most dramatic urbanizing countries, Indonesia, and based in Jakarta. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for invite me here for Power and for Shirley. For me, it's the space of heritage in modern age. Is I want to make a short to in my country context. I believe that now climate in my country is very beautiful. Between 25 and 35, they are make me use free space according to that. The first, we have acculturate come to my country. First, indigenous culture as vernacular architecture, and then second is Hindu and Buddha came. Third is Muslim. Fourth, colonial, and this modern era. This is my country, and this is our heritage. There's so many things about puppet architecture, batik, culture, and now is turned to the modern era, which also related to that era, but we are make a new. Regarding to the context of the climate that I said, you see all the shape of the architecture is so different from the south until north, from the east until west, because I believe because also the possibility about the roof is to make the architecture like this. If it's difficult to 4 seasons because maybe snow, but the architecture can express culture. This my exhibition elevation. Also, I start to use our free space for the vernacular, for the skin, and also for the bone, and also sample for the architecture, how the architecture lived from the 0 until 10 meters. And another influence is elevated house typology. This is various house typology in Indonesia, and this is also inspired me as an architect to use this typology to make my architecture like pilotis, very thin, and let the air flow. Also we use plant as an umbrella, because in culture, in tropical climate, it's not really essential to make a wall. You have to make a seal, because the temperature is very very generous. Also, another house is very open and close in the bedroom area, but open, very open, and then let the air. This is pilotis look like the architecture at the past, but we can use a space for now. And the bedroom area also has a communal space, and the bedroom area here. And this is also free space for the children to activate, to make activity here. Also, another house is only two structure at here and then another, but this is also wrapping by roof, dominated by roof, but at the same time there's also floating. Like this. And also we are use a porous wall. At the history, this is like porous, but we use a brick, and then they are also still same principle, but in the modern age. This is another, also another project, and this is same with a brick, also can breathe. This is with wood. Another project is airport. This is also same principle. We use roof, and the roof made from heritage. Also for the social. And the last project is aquatic. This is heritage from 1962, and we make a new roof. And this is still air breath. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll come back to how you've dealt with this issue in what is a changing context and an accelerated time in your country. Chino, let's ask for the last presentation. Chino Zuki will be very familiar to many of you in the room. If you go out of this building and turn right, you will see his relationship between architecture, memory, and heritage as the curator and also designer of the Italian Pavilion, professor at Milan Polytechnic, and head of a major architectural practice. Welcome
Give me
to
the power.
you.
No, I want the power.
You want the power? Thank you, Chino.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Quite a deep thank you, Shelley, Paolo, and Ricky. quite a difficult subject to do in such few minutes, but while everybody's talking, I was looking in Cambridge Dictionary what is the definition of heritage, and it says features belonging to the culture of a particular society, such as traditions, languages, or buildings that were created in the past and still have historical importance, which means a heritage is an object, but also that we give value or has an attached value. The problem is, are these values permanently attached to the object or they're obsolete? So every heritage poses a problem of interpretation in time and shift. In a way, when Henri Faucillon in La Vie de Forme used to say, when we look at the relationship between form and meaning, we can just see the shift between the two. There's some forms which empty the original meaning and they act like molds where you can pour a new meaning, and some meaning which looks for a form to be represented. So the question is a complex one. I start from a heritage which is totally internal of the discipline, which is classical architecture. This is a typical Beaux-Arts d'Amboise of an axonometric showing how the Parthenon is built in wood. And this is the interpretation of Auguste Choisy that tries to, in a way, solve the conflict between what Vitruvius says, that the stone construction was originated by wood, and in a way interprets the triglyph as three little wooden things and the mutules as things and the little gutte as bars. So in a way, try to find some kind of etymology in the wood construction of the Doric order. And how much this heritage, in this case the drawings of Baldassare Peruzzi or Palladio, which go to Rome and measure very carefully all the Ionic bases, so how much this historical data, which Roman architecture in this case was important in the formation of Renaissance by this sort of measure drawings, and how this has to do with interpretation. In the first translation in Italian of Vitruvius by Cesare Cesariano, who was a pupil of Bramante, Vitruvius has no illustrators, so to illustrate the Tuscan Displuviatum, Corinthian, and Testudinatum Cavedia, he uses Milanese courtiers from the Renaissance, which were totally non-Vitruvian in a way. And to represent the concept of ethnografia, orthographia, let's say plan and section, he uses the Duomo of Milano. So he uses a Gothic cathedral to explain Vitruvius, giving images to what Vitruvio did not have. I always loved this very functionalist building represented by Viollet-le-Duc, the greatest connoisseur of medieval architecture. If we want to hang many people at the same time, it's very rational to hang them all in these buildings, and then you have a place to put all the skeletons. How can a beautiful building, be such a horrible destination? That's a big question, And in the discipline, this is Francisco Javier Sanz Eloísa, one of the best Spanish architects. He did this marvelous building, the Banco de Bilbao, relieving, measuring the Parthenon, and then undoubtedly in the most modern building of Madrid, when he has to do a parapet, he uses some kind of Ionic base. Or Louis Kahn, who sketches in this sort of psychedelic colors, Luxor Temple, and then its synagogue in a sort of contradictory way. So, but I want to go back to a contradiction, which was mostly pointed out by Alois Riegler in his famous Der moderne Denkmalkultus, the modern cult of the monument. He says, if we talk about historic structure and relating to its conservation, in a way, we can look at them in different ways, and if we logically assume a strategy of conservation according to these ways, we can get to very different results. He says, if we value the historical value of a monument, we should, in a way, reconstruct it to his original state, to show the little children how it was in ancient Greece. If we look at the antiquity value, the passing of time which left its traces on the monument is a value. And then, of course, we can also use it as a use value. And he says these things are in contradiction. That's a big point to me. So this is the reconstruction, the perfect reconstruction of the Nashville Parthenon in Nashville, and then they made a Sonne Lumière projecting the original color. Vitruvius says the triglyphs were turquoise, and Salvatore Settis made this wonderful exposition in Milano. It's called Serial Classic, about the copies in antiquity, and he shocked us with, we were shocked when we discovered the colorfulness of, I think inside they even made a statue of Athena, which is all gold. So, could we look back at antiquity without the filter of neoclassicism? The question, going back to the barbarian quality of antiquity, and with its original colors. So this would be applying literally historical value of regal. This is applied the antiquity value, the famous, the etching by Piranesi on the Appia Antica in its present state. We love this monument because it's faceless. Something is only, it does not look what it would have looked before. Or, in a way, they use value. Each year we have the Salone del Mobile in Milano. We use very well the courtyard of the Ospedale Maggiore to do our own things. But how can we put together these things? Going back from this internal value of classical architecture to what we consider today heritage, in a way, we extended the concept of heritage to, in a way, all the anthropized world. A Mexican fishing village, industrial archaeology is also heritage, and in a way, the agricultural landscape. We live in the Po River Valley. All Europe is an anthropized, even landscape. So this widening up of the concept of heritage went from something almost internal to the discipline to almost the whole world. It's like the Mappa di Babele di Borges. Can we consider heritage all the buildings I see on my Vespa when I go to the university? This is the backdrop of every Vespa ride and building for the 50s. In a way, everything that was yesterday, it's heritage. Everything, even these bottles here are, in a way, because they're expression of material culture. So the totalization of memory, everything that's not just now, it is heritage, and that's a paradox. Can we freeze it? But talking about more spiritual, I really like the debate about identity between Baratta and Shelley. Sometimes it happens to me to, when people talk about tradition, to quote this quote by Paul Valéry. He says, in a way, tradition is a tradition only when it is unconscious. To revive a tradition is a false expression, because when you revive a tradition, it's not a tradition anymore, so it becomes a conscious act and can be judged as much as the others. This, to me, is the condition I live in as an architect. What do you do? It's a choice. It's not just something be continued by itself. So, when you're there at the table sketching, what the hell do you do? Because you have to make choices. Of course, we're not alone to make choices. Also, we can look and analyze. This is a book I wrote many years ago. And the other day I opened up a drawer, and this has my hand drawings. These are China ink drawings of all the courtyards of Milano drawn by China ink when the computer was not yet there. So, in a way, observing is also selecting, measuring, and so on, in a way like, I don't know, like if Baldassare Peruzzi, but that kind of thing. And then, you can do the same on modernism. As Nagovender were sort of unknown local heroes, and now, for example, Caruso St. John just wrote a book about, I think in the cover he had the San Verga, so we have some kind of modern heritage. When I had to do the pavilion here, it was Rem Koolhaas, and Rem Koolhaas gave this very good slogan to the foreign pavilion was absorbing modernity 1914-2014. So I said, how can I talk about Italy? And this idea of grafting, the idea that Italy, of course, I did the first graft. I think they left it there also. So it was called Archimbuto, like archi-funnel, something between Arco and Buto. But there was some kind of open books saying, like in Italy, the whole Italy is such a layered country. This is the Campidoglio before Michelangelo, that in a way we never act on virgin soil. So the whole history of both modern and ancient architecture in Italy is working on something which is already there. And even modernity had to do more sophisticated strategy. We had this map showing all the Milano, and then we had little chapels, and there's a little Cacciadomignoni chapel there, and this year, Shelley and Yvonne asked me to do something about Cacciadomignoni. This is him at work. He just died, he was 102 years old and was almost unknown outside of Milano, very, very Milanese figure. And we did this installation, you can see at the Giardini, this sort of panettone, analyzing his work. And this is a sketch by Cacciado Mignoni. One day he called me up and said, Cino Zucchi, you never come visit. I said, I'll come visit. And said, oh, your architects are good, you even sort of, like this, but, let me tell you, you don't know anything about plans. He took one of my buildings, this is a plan of my buildings, with white correction paper and white correction things, and then he totally redrawn it, saying, can I give you some suggestion about it? So this is an original Cacciado Mignoni on my buildings, which is usually the reverse, when you talk about mannerism, intervention, it's funny, it's sort of the other way around. Okay, so again, with Paul Paleri, nothing more original than feeding myself with others, but digest them. How do we digest heritage? The lion is made out of digestive sheep. So very quickly, I go zooming. Lavazza is just a building with some existing buildings in integration. 2 minutes, okay? So these are, it's a new headquarters with very complex project which integrates some kind of industrial buildings, but the sides of these buildings didn't exist because it was a precinct. So these are sort of grafts, in a way, on the existing building, the facade on the street, to make them into a new open space. So you see the old buildings, the new buildings, and also these sort of connecting joints. This is the other side. So all these are partial new intervention to graft in where things were not opening because you had a building. This is we did a very nice new garden. This is the original facade, but again, this is sort of new portico, like blending in the facade. We did the new facade of the side, which now becomes a front on the thing, and the interior. And then we found a Romanesque basilica underneath. So we even managed to change completely the project to let it show, and we sort of opened up the garden, and now you can see it and children can visit it. So just to say that also there we visit on the ground, you have the Molo Antonelliano. And very quickly, since Shelley talked about Venice, we had the chance to win this competition. I will not tell the whole story, which is very complicated. The funny thing is that you had an existing situation which was industrial, it was the industrial factory, and the image of Venice we have, with gondolas singing O Sole Mio, the romantic view. This was the real Venice there, but in a way it was in contradiction with my developer's view of Venice. This is what was there. So it's a very complex game between, this was the original situation. This is the new plan, we open up a new canal and the black buildings I did. But so many of these buildings are existing. For example, this one, this is an existing school. I will not go through it, just very quickly. This, for example, this was the shape of the face of the building as it was, and this is a heavy restoration, even continuing a piece here. So this was a piece head, and giving it its face to the public space. So the theme was that the precinct of the factory was completely closed. I'm also done. This is the reconstruction of the building. Okay, just to say that this is another sort of new integral reconstruction. Okay. We even use many times the foundation. These are constructed on the wooden piles. You see the back of it. And this is, for some reason, is the one who was most liked. I don't know. It's cheap housing, it's subsidized housing. We cut this new, about free space. We did not just did the buildings, we cut new sort of alleyways to go to the square. So the theme of public space was very important. We cut the chimney. The closest thing we could do for modern building rules to do. You cannot literally reproduce it. And this sees, in a way, the relationship. We try to be contemporary, but also somehow picking up. So this is a drawing, I finish with this, with Heinrich Fuseli says, the artist cries over the lost greatness of the ancients. Can we, we should cry there. And this is Cino Zucchi crying. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Right, if we can have the lights up in the room. We've had 4 very powerful presentations. I know, Paolo, you have some observations. And then you have to go.
Yes. No, it's thank you all of you for having accepted the challenge. of the definition. Of course, one thing seems to me relevant, but that after all, we are the main actors. We decide what is memory. We decide what is heritage. We decide what is free. We decide what is that we desire. So it's once again back to the Constitution, a step forward, very important step forward, because our written concepts that represent a common will. Then we are left once again alone, because we have all of us to understand which is the phenomenology through which all what we have been talking about takes place. Where are the energies? Where are the individual energies, which are the energies that have to be developed by public institutions? To what extent is enlightened selfishness sufficient? To what extent we have to impose on our community a common will, and which way do we reach that common will, and in which way our desires can be developed so to build up that common will. Emperors and popes did provide us with public space. Now we have to take care of them with our own will and with our own procedures, having the market and political procedures in front of us to deal with. Something the market can do, something the market cannot do, and then we are back as citizens to the problem of how to build a common will and a common decision and common processes according to which we can reach our aim, both relatively to the heritage or the common and the free space. Well, I mean, my conclusion is not as pessimistic as the idea that only catastrophes can induce us to change our mind and to desire new things. I can even quote from the Voltaire himself did say, at least we have l'espérance. We are left with the powerful tool, which is the will and the hope. But once again, as head of this institution, I think that after all, this is exactly what we have to do. The enhancement of the desire for this, the enhancement and not of the identity, but of self-consciousness of what we are and we can do and what we want. It's a common self-consciousness which belongs to all of us. And sometimes identity hides the very fact that there is a self-consciousness problem that is common to all of us. Here, once again, I am to the problem of identity, which is certainly a very powerful tool to implement, to give energy, to provide energy, but at the same time, it is dangerous if we exceed and go beyond a certain limit. Therefore, it's not a term that I do really like. Self-consciousness is something that brings us back to the idea that human being has to look beyond his shoes, has to look beyond, to look at indirect effects of its actions, posthumous, belated effects of whatever we do, giving value to indirect effects and costs or indirect advantages of all our actions. So is the human being that has to be capable of seeing beyond its short and this short personal individual space. And this somehow is common space and free space, the capability to see beyond what is just our physical identity and going back to our capability of seeing beyond. Seeing beyond is a title of a possible Biennale of Art, but seeing beyond is exactly what even architecture seems to be, could be the requirement that can unite I mean, and that can make a Biennale useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paolo needs to leave, so won't. Thank you. So I think, Elizabeth, you've been invited to curate the next art exhibition with your comment on seeing beyond than the notion for reflection. Should we go on for another 5 minutes so that we have a few questions? Paolo, thank you very much. Shelley, did you comment?
Thank you, Paolo. Actually, just as he's leaving the room, I just want to say something about him which is not derogatory, but it's also Salvatore. He's also leaving. Anyway, I'll keep going. It was really interesting what Salvatore said, was that free space should be demanded as a right. And actually, one of the discussions that came up with Grafton and Paolo Barato was the meaning of the word generosity. The generosity may be a bit like the way that the word identity is interrogated. The word generosity was interrogated because of this idea of benevolence as opposed to right. And I think that's also a really important question. What I'm really delighted about today, and it reminds me of a meeting held a couple of weeks ago on the practice of teaching. And one of the speakers suggested that the teaching was about drawing together, using Elizabeth's word of drawing, but it was also about drawing together. And that we should or could, and maybe would, at some point, think about ourselves as one being as opposed to a series of individuals. I think the term used was that we're not always separate minds, that we don't always have to dwell on the differences, but to, and I'm not speaking about agreement, I just feel that there's a sympathy and a connection and a cohesion and a strength in each of the individual messages is made in a completely different way, but is saying the same thing, which is that free space and heritage and time and life and the need for architecture to facilitate life and to allow the freedom for people to be. And this is something which sounds terribly simple, but it's extremely radical in our current world, that the idea of somebody in Ireland asked us, we were actually asking them for money, and they said, well, is free space going to be a movement? And we thought it was not an architect, but it was a very interesting question. Could free space become a movement? And I think that comment, that free space is something that should be demanded and could be demanded as a right, it was one of the things we thought about in thinking about a title for the Biennale, that it could be in some ways confusing because it's not specific in its meaning, but on the other hand, it's quite simple because it's free and it's about space. And that it could be a way of people somehow starting to think, well, where is the free space? Where is my free space? What is it that this world or this architecture is doing for me? And I find that kind of, I don't want to use the wrong word because it's not as if we're all the same. I think there is so much difference from different cultures, but there is something about one mind which I find potentially very strong and very interesting.
What I'd like to do is, because of needing to close up, is in reverse order, ask all of you literally for 30 seconds just to comment on this aspect of generosity, or interpret it even further. I'm thinking, Salvatore, about your interpretation or addition of the notion of governance, and therefore legislation is, you can't have generous spaces unless someone cares about them, etc. Can you all just reflect on this issue as we walk back across the room to the end of the panel? Cino.
I think this, shift in time of the relationship with form and values is the guarantee of democracy. When you think of the Hagia Sophia was a church and became that, whenever a revolution or something gets the spaces of the old, they, in a way, as he said, they take it and modified it. And the Italian almost, the coast style of Addis Ababa, it's now identical, even if it was the symbol of oppression. Some days ago, there was a debate about the Casa del Fascio di Terragni, whether to call it the Casa of the ex-Casa del Fascio. The son of the nephew of Terragni, Attilio Terragni, sustained that the name was called, you don't say ex-Palazzo Farnese, so it was its name, and then it was so the political issue, how much the fascism is attached to Casa del Fascio, it's a big question. And this shift to me is the guarantee of democracy, that even if something is born with an idea, in time it loses it, like Ozymandias, there's this famous poem by Shelley, this statue in the middle of the desert which has no more name. So statues have no more names. They lose the name and they remain the stones.
Elizabeth.
I think there's a twin word to free space, which is shared space, maybe, and I think the difficulty, of course, but I think if you think of the favelas, for instance, I'm part of the jury of Ralph Erskine Prize, and we look for projects where there is a social agenda in the architecture project, I think the shared space can actually be acquired precisely in that type of environment, made by people themselves. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that I think we're so drugged by consuming. I mean, that's we're kind of being made really idiots. And I think that maybe some of the catastrophes actually can help us to wake up from that kind of drugged. But I think as an architect, that you have to address that. You have to think about that. You have to think about how you actually work.
Salvatore?
Well, very quickly, I wanted to point out very briefly about two different components of this discussion. One is about the value of drawing, of architectural drawing, not just the drawing you do during for a project, but the drawing after the architecture, which is an interpretive drawing and which is which has a huge role in establishing cultural memory, and the way how we interpret the architectural drawing is very important in this respect. The second point is about what I would call the paradox of conservation. There is no conservation without alteration. Alteration is essential to conservation. So the example of Hagia Sophia has been already made. My favorite example is the Cathedral of Syracuse of Syracusa in Sicily, which was a temple, a Greek temple, same decade as the Parthenon, then transformed into a church, then into a mosque, then again into a church. So it has been altered significantly, but these alterations, while they ensured preservation, they also added dimensions. So I think that this stratification of cultural, this layered nature of cultural memory is very critical, a very critical component. We are constantly talking in terms of interpretation, yes, but while we interpret, we also need rules.
Right. Andrea? No? Okay, then. Fazl?
Yes, all the heritage spaces, the spaces that we see, people, the spaces that you were showing and what I was showing are spaces where ordinary people, the average citizen, lives, experiences the daily life. For those who come and want to develop, who want to make something better, they don't have that kind of relationship. It can be the millionaires, the developers, the billionaires, and so on. They do not experience these spaces the way we do, the way we ordinary people move, sit, talk, meet, and so on. Every time that in the name of progress, in the name of development, that these spaces are taken away from people, it is a deprivation of the civic right of every individual in any nation, in any city. So it's also a matter of rights. So the heritage spaces are usually these open spaces, and we need to protect them. So beyond becoming an architect, we need to be also activists. in the name of protecting our heritage spaces, which are also the free spaces of every city.
Thank you.
I think I would continue to with what Fasil said, that very often as architects we sort of expect a brief and a client to come with a project and a brief and the money. And I think perhaps maybe more in our countries where our governments are still grappling with basics of shelter, water, and just like you mentioned, whether that money should go into, providing infrastructural requirements. And therefore, culture and funding for culture is really so low on the government agenda that very often architects have to stop, ask themselves this question: that do I want to be in my practice comfortable in my studio, getting clients to do really expensive private projects, which is absolutely my right to choose, but also would I want to engage more with the political process, with the urban process, and sometimes don the hat of an activist and an architect, because I believe in that. And I do feel that architecture is a very, very political profession, and architecture as a verb, as a process, is highly political, and that is, it's not by default or by coincidence that the greatest dynasties and the greatest politicians and the greatest visionaries across the world, across centuries, have actually left behind the greatest landmarks in architecture, and it's really not a coincidence. But why is it that when we talk of architecture today in the 21st century, we expect it to be somebody's idea and somebody's vision, and us to be just sort of being contracted to create and to make that idea happen? And for that reason, I think it's important that heritage, even there's a distinction between the way heritage is seen, even in my country, when there is an issue. Why is it that in Mumbai we are so much more active as a citizenry about saving our own heritage? It's perhaps that on the entire island city of Bombay, there was not even one monument that was nationally protected, because in a country where you have, ancient civilizations, and you have the Indus Valley sites, and you have Mughal and Islamic and Hindu sites and Buddhist sites dating back 4,000 years, a 19th and 20th century architecture of colonization was really not even considered worth conserving. And that's when the citizens felt that because they were more empowered, purely because the government just wasn't bothered, that you see so much more engagement. And also the second thing is that instead of a fenced-off site that was like a dead tomb or a palace that you don't feel engaged with, our heritage in Mumbai is the railway station we use every day, the school that we go to every day, the Victorian Gothic courts or the hospital buildings. These are all what we consider as our own, and therefore a greater engagement.
So we started talking about words like heritage, free space. We're ending up with democracy and politics. It's impossible to disconnect them, and I think that's the point of this exhibition, this discussion. I'm so sorry we haven't asked you to comment, but most of them are all here. So please come down and have a chat with the panelists, but join me in thanking all of them and La Biennale for organizing this event. Thank you very much to all of them.